All right, guys. So this is the last video of the week. So we're going to go over potential objections to this physicalist argument. So possible objections. Okay, so rejecting premise one. Mental effects have physical effects. I already talked about occasionalism, which is the idea that we have like physical causal processes going on, and then we also have mental causal processes going on, and that they're going on at the exact same time, at the exact same rhythm, and they're totally coordinated all the time, regularly with any individual. And but there's no actual interaction. So they just like maybe a higher power designed it this way or something along those lines, but there's no actual cause and effect going on. Maybe it's coincidence, maybe it's a greater power, we're not sure. But another way to deny interactionism, which is this idea that mental events have physical events, is with epiphenomenalism, which is another long, crazy term. Epiphenomenalism is saying that mental events do not cause physical events. So how's this different from occasionalism? Occasionalism denies any interaction at all, whereas epiphenomenalism does not deny any interaction at all. The epiphenomenalist admits that physical events cause mental events. Lighting the match under your arm causes the pain, but the pain does not cause you to move your arm. Some physical process causes you to move your arm. The pain is just there. You're just experiencing it, but it's not doing anything. So the first proponent of this view is Thomas Huxley, who was known as Darwin's bulldog because he accepted evolution, he accepted natural selection, and he was quite adamantly defending it during this time, especially because so many people did not accept evolution at this time. And he's also the grandfather to Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World, Doors of Perception, two great books, especially Brave New World. If you've never read it, definitely read it, as really great philosophical, it touches on a lot of philosophical topics. Another person who was an epiphenomenalist was William James. So I'm going to read a couple quotes from them. So Huxley said that mental events are like a steam whistle that contributes nothing to the world of a locomotive. William James said that mental events are like the shadows our bodies produce. And so mental events affect physical events no more than a shadow reacts upon the steps of the traveler who it accompanies. So what does that mean? When Huxley was writing, they had, trains, and the physical train would produce steam. So it causes the steam, but the steam doesn't cause anything. It's just, once it emits, it's there, but that's it. Same thing with the shadow. So our physical bodies with the physical sun cause a shadow, but the shadow does not cause anything. It doesn't react upon the steps of the traveler. It doesn't influence anything. It doesn't do anything. It's just a result, an effect of the physical, but it doesn't cause anything further. Yeah, so that's all I was just saying here, that there's this causation between physical event and the mental event, but no causation between mental event and the next physical event. Okay. So what's their evidence for this view? Well, Huxley was working with animals at the time, doing experiments on frogs, and he realized that if you cut a frog's brain in a certain way, they are no longer conscious, at least if the understanding of brain structures is correct, which he was correct about. But yet they behave as though they are conscious. So if you put something in their way, they hop around it. If you put water in front of them, they will drink. If you throw them in water, they will swim. So they're acting as though they are conscious, but they're not. And because their brain is severed, we cannot say that the mental event is what's causing them to act. We can only say that there's some physical process that's causing them to act in this way. And you might think, well, who cares if some animal, especially a frog, does that? But then Huxley stumbled upon this case study. This was a French army surgeon who, during battle, was wounded. He fractured his left parietal bone, so he had a brain injury. And there were certain periods of his life where he was totally conscious and totally normal. And if you were to ask him, he would say, "Yes, I'm conscious, I'm normal, everything's fine." But every now and then, he would have these episodes where like from an outside perspective, you wouldn't even notice that he was having an episode, but after the episode was over, you would ask him and he would say, no, actually, I was having one of these episodes. And during these episodes, he was totally unconscious. He was not aware of what he was doing, or he didn't have any thoughts. It was like he was sleepwalking, except for during these episodes, he would still behave as though he was conscious. So again, I'm reading from Huxley. He eats, drinks, smokes, walks about, dresses and undresses himself, rises and goes to bed at the accustomed hours. Nevertheless, pins may be run into his body or strong electrical shocks sent through it without causing the least indication of pain. No odorous substance, pleasant or unpleasant, makes the least impression. So what's going on here? Well, he's behaving like he's conscious. So he goes to bed at the same time, he gets up at the same time, he dresses himself, and he smokes and he shaves and he does all these things that he would ordinarily do, but he's not conscious of any of it. And not only is he not conscious from the fact that when we ask him after the episode, he says he wasn't conscious, but also like when we cause pain to his body, he doesn't feel it. Or when we put this odorous substance in front of him, he doesn't act like he's smelling something really disgusting. So he's not having any mental states at this time. Yet, despite him not having these mental states, he's still behaving as though he has them. So he's still eating. So you would only eat if you have the mental state of hunger. But yet this guy did not have the mental state of hunger and ate. Or you'd only sleep if you have the mental state of being tired. And yet this guy couldn't have any mental states and he was still going to bed. So Huxley came up with this argument. A man without the necessary physical features of the brain for some mental states can produce physical effects as though he is experiencing those mental states. If one, then some mental states are not necessary for physical states. Therefore, physical states are not caused by mental states. He generalized from these instances to all physical states and all mental states, but maybe that's a way to attack his view. Maybe you think that's too big of a leap. But I think his evidence is pretty compelling. I mean, what else could be causing this French army surgeon or the frogs to behave in these ways if it's not some physical process causing it? Further evidence for this view are Libet experiments. I don't know if you've ever heard of these, but this guy Libet hooked his test subjects up to brain scanners, and then he asked them to flex their wrist whenever they wanted. And then he also asked them to watch a clock and record the time that they made the decision to flex. So Libet found that his test subjects made a decision to flex about 0.15 seconds before their muscles actually flexed. So they made the decision, and then it took 0.15 seconds for them to actually move their wrist. But the brain scans showed that the brain had signs of ramping up or getting ready to flex 0.55 seconds before the muscles flexed. So the brain state occurred earlier than the conscious mental state, the decision. It seems like the physical process in these experiments are producing the mental effect, the decision, and the physical effect, the action. It's not that the decision produced the action, it's the brain state produces both. And I mean, the brain showed signs of being able to produce about to produce the muscle motion 0.4 seconds before the subjects were consciously aware of their decision to move. This has some serious implications for free will. So if our bodies are ready to act before we consciously decide to act, then it seems like we don't have conscious control over our actions, and thus we don't have free will. If someone does something when they're sleepwalking or if they're hypnotized, we wouldn't say they have free will. Why? Because they don't have conscious control over their actions. I'm pretty sure there's some legal cases, some criminal cases of people doing some crazy stuff when they're sleepwalking, and yet they are not prosecuted. They are not held responsible for their actions because when they're sleepwalking, they don't have conscious control. So if these Libet experiments are a problem for free will, it's because they're treating this brain action causing the result, the flip of the wrist, not the decision is not causing the flip of the wrist. So they're treating that as though as like a sleepwalking case, except for we're not sleepwalking or we're not hypnotized. We're believing that the conscious decision to move my wrist is what causes the wrist and not some physical process that I'm not even consciously aware of. But even if you don't buy that this undermines free will, it does have another serious implication. It undermines the incorrigibility of introspection. So remember when I was talking about Swinburne and privileged access, I said that our introspective awareness of our mental states is incorrigible. It means it's we cannot be wrong. When I'm in pain, I cannot be wrong about that. But it seems like, well, I'm thinking that my decision to move my wrist is what's causing my wrist. That's a matter of introspection, that I believe my decision causes me to move my wrist. Well, that means my introspection is wrong. The decision was not what caused me to move my wrist. It was the brain state. So here I was saying that introspection is foolproof, that we can never be wrong, but it seems like, yes, actually it is foolproof. We can be wrong, and privileged access is now vulnerable. And going back to Huxley's army surgeon argument, if we saw this guy walking around smoking and drinking and shaving and doing all these things, would we be able to tell that he's not conscious? I think everybody from an outside point of view who is ignorant to the brain injury of this man would just say that, yeah, he's just a normal guy acting like a normal guy. So we wouldn't be able to identify that he's not conscious. So this idea of a not really zombie Ange, but zombie people with brains who just don't have minds rears its ugly head again. So again, the problem of other minds, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later in this video. Objections to premise 2, the causal closure of physics. We did talk about this already. If you object to PSR, then you're probably going to object to this one as well, but you really have to bite a bullet to say that PSR is false and to apply the interactions at the basement level of reality, at the quantum physics level, to the entirety of science, when the entirety of science has relied on PSR and has been super successful. But there's this other argument about the uncertainty of the future. So we don't know what the future will hold. Sure, up to this point, we've been super successful with science and its reliance on PSR, but that does not mean that the future will be just like the past. So for all we know, much of the universe might be like the uranium atoms, and we just don't know what it's going to be like. But again, I think you're biting a huge bullet if you want to endorse this claim, because the success of science really is an integral part of every single one of our lives, and to deny that the method that led to these successes is incorrect would be a bullet. So 1 and 3 are believed by most. I didn't talk about any objections to the overdetermination is rare. I think if you wanted to object to it, you might have to make the case that these examples I talked about, like the lungs and the kidneys, I said that the effects are not numerically identical. So if you have 2 lungs, you're going to be able to run really fast, but with one lung, you're not going to be able to run that fast. And so I'm saying that the result is not numerically identical. I think you could push back on that a little bit if you wanted to deny premise 3, but most people aren't going to deny it. And most people are not going to deny 1, at least the physicalist and the dualist can both accept 1 and 3. And then premise 2, many people haven't really thought about it, but once you do think about it, it's usually accepted. An important difference between this argument and the dualist argument is that every single one of these premises are defended with induction. So mental states have physical events. What's the defense? Is this like our common sense understanding of why I move my arms and why I do the things I do? And that's all induction. It's my observations of myself. I guess you can maybe make the case that it's introspection, but I'm not just using myself as an example. I'm using other people too to defend this premise 1. Like if I lit a match under your arm, I'm assuming that your mental state of pain is what causes you to move away. Physical effects have physical causes. Like I said, PSR science, that's all induction, and overdetermination is rare. Again, we have to look at nature. We have to look into the world and to see what's going on. And then we see that the overdetermination is just not happening that often. So all induction. Descartes, Swinburne, on the other hand, their premises are defended with deduction. So they're all deductive reasoning. I'm not sure if it's going to sway you one way or the other when you just finally decide which argument you're going to pick, but it's just important to note the different methods being used for each argument. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem of their minds, and I am using this Ryle argument, which is I wrote Ryle's myth, but it's actually Descartes' myth, is what he was talking about. His argument: if dualism is true, then it is impossible to tell whether there are any other people. Premise 2: it is not impossible to tell whether there are any other people. Therefore, it's not the case that dualism is true. So that's valid. But why should we entertain this argument? So premise 1: if dualism is true, then it is impossible to tell whether there are other people, and this is the problem of other minds. So solipsism is this incredibly skeptical view about the world that says that only the self can be known to exist. So it follows from this: I think, therefore I am. Therefore, like, it's the idea that my existence is indubitable. Like, in virtue of doubting my existence, I am affirming my existence. That was that whole premise I talked about last week. But when I attribute mental states to other people, I don't have that that level of justification. And we talked a little bit about the reasoning process behind ascribing mental states to other people. So here's an example. I formalized the argument. If I'm in pain, then I yell out, or I move away from the painful stimuli, or I exhibit some other painful behavior. Premise 2: you are yelling out, you're moving away from the painful stimuli, or you're demonstrating some other painful behavior. Conclusion: you are in pain. But if you guys are looking at this argument carefully, you should notice that it's not a good argument at all. There's two different devastating fallacies going on here. The first is a formal fallacy, and it's affirming the consequent, so it's invalid. If I wanted to make it valid, I would have to change the first premise so that it would say, if I yell out in pain or move away from the painful stimuli or exhibit some other painful behavior, then I'm in pain. But if I change that first premise, then it seems inaccurate and false. So I don't know if you've ever done this, but have you ever touched a stove and then you pull your hand away, like anticipating the pain, and then the stove's not even on? So there, I'm moving my hand away. It's true, but I'm not in pain. So if I flip this first conditional around so that I make the argument valid, I've just said something false, because it could be there are many instances in which I demonstrate painful behaviors, but I'm not actually in pain. Sometimes I'm walking and I'll like hit the side of a desk and I yell out but I'm not actually in pain. So I'm yelling out before the pain even happens. Then after the fact, I feel kind of stupid for doing that. So I can't use the principle of charity to try to make this argument valid, because then I've now made one of the premises false. The informal fallacy going on here is its generalization from one case to all cases. And this is a no-no in science, right? Like, if you want to make any kind of generalization about all cases in the world, you need more than just one single case as your justification. And in this one, I am my one single case. So I need more evidence in order to conclude that you and everybody else that I see are in pain, and it can't just be my own painful experiences. And I wanted to take a little segue and talk about Wittgenstein. So Wittgenstein he's dead, a famous philosopher of language and mathematics. And so I don't know, in ancient Greece, if you know this, there is Socrates, and he was like the OG philosopher, but he trained and he taught Plato, who's another like incredibly famous philosopher, and Plato taught Aristotle. So there's this like chain of like teacher-pupil relationships going on in ancient Greece. And Wittgenstein is a part of this kind of trio of just way later down the line. So Wittgenstein was trained by Bertrand Russell, and Bertrand Russell was trained by Gottlob Frege, and all three of these philosophers did all kinds of work in philosophy of math and philosophy of language, which was kind of like a new way to do philosophy. It was a transition. It was a paradigm shift in philosophy, was focusing on philosophy of language. But Wittgenstein talked a lot about the problem of other minds, but he talked about it in terms of philosophy of language. So I'm going to read a little quote from him. And again, I'm only talking about these guys because they're super famous. So I want you to leave this class at least knowing, or at least have heard the name Wittgenstein. He writes, everyone had a box with something in it. We call it a beetle. No one can look in anyone else's box, and everyone says he knows what a beetle is only by looking at his own beetle. Here, it would be quite possible for everyone to have something different in his box. One might even imagine such a thing constantly changing. But suppose the word beetle had a use in these people's language. If so, it would not be used as the name of the thing. The thing in the box has no place in the language game at all, not even as something, for the box might be empty. No one can divide through the thing in the box. It cancels out whatever it is. So what's the idea here? And Wittgenstein was incredibly difficult, he is incredibly difficult to understand. And there's even this famous story about him, how he wrote his one of his first books, and he was really excited about it, but then every single person who read it took it the wrong way. And he even had someone write the prelogue or the intro for him, and the guy like totally butchered the book, and he was so upset because he's like, this is nothing to do with what my intention was for this book. But yeah, he's a very difficult person to understand. But and here he's talking very metaphorically with this beetle. But the idea here is that beetle is like pain or any mental state. So we all have a box, we all have a mind, and we all have something in our mind, like a painful state, a mental state. And here he says beetle. I can't look in your mind. I can't look in your box to look at your beetle, to look at your painful state. And it's possible that every single person has a different beetle or a different mental state when they're talking about their beetle or talking about their mental state. And he says the box might even be empty. So there might not be any mental state in your head when you say that you are in pain. He thought that language must have rules. And this obviously includes mental state language as well. And he thought that language was kind of like a game. And you can't have private rules for a game, because in order for a game to work, other people playing the game have to know the rules. If we use private language to express what we mean when we're talking about our mental states, then we run into these problems of, well, how do you know that what you're talking about is referring to the same thing that I'm talking about? Because every word in our language has a referent. It picks something out in the world. So if you think about the word rock, a rock picks out certain objects in the world. And if I use the word rock to refer to a tree, I would have made a mistake. And I would have broken the rules of the proper usage of the word rock. You all out here, language users as well, part of playing this language game, can correct me when I incorrectly use the word, because you know all of the rules. If I'm the only one who knows what I'm referencing when I say rock or pain, and there are no rules to correct me when I'm wrong, then when I'm obeying the rules, I might be breaking the rules, and there's no way to verify whether or not I'm playing the game properly, because I have my own private set of rules. I could never be wrong, even when I'm using the word incorrectly. And that's a huge problem for Wittgenstein, and a huge problem for this topic of internal mental states. Okay, so defending, and this is all an implication of dualism, like I said, because I know my own mental states, but I only know your mental states in virtue of your behaviors. I don't know your mental states from a first person perspective immediately and indubitably. So defending premise 2 of this argument, it's not impossible to tell whether there are other people. Some physicalists want to say that the dualist is making a conceptual mistake. They want to say that mental concepts or words like pain should be defined in terms of their cause and effect, not in terms of their structure. And why do they say that? They want to say that most words are defined in terms of cause and effect, not in terms of structure. But of course, now we have to talk about, what does it mean when I say a functional mental state versus a structural mental state? So I'm going to use an ordinary uncontroversial example to explain. Again, this is just part of the philosophy method. Think of the word eraser. In America, here I have an eraser right here. It's almost worn out, but it's there. This little thing on the end of the pencil. This is a functional term. Why? Because eraser, it erases things. It's the function of the object. That's why we named it eraser. But if you ever lived in England or visited England, you would know, or you might be aware, that people over there call it a rubber. And why do they call it a rubber? Because that's the structure of the object. It's made out of rubber. Now, what's the difference between a rubber and an eraser? There is no difference. There's every rubber is numerically identical to some eraser. They're one and the same thing. This rubber is numerically identical to this eraser. Is there a correct way to describe this object? No, I don't think there's a better way. I don't think rubber is better than eraser, and I don't think eraser is better than rubber. Why is it called a rubber over there and an eraser here? I'm not sure. It could just have been an accident. I'm not sure why, but I don't think there's a normative reason behind it. And there are other terms like this in our language. So consider the word chair. Is chair functional or structural? I'm going to say it's functional. Why? Because I don't think any kind of structural criteria excludes something from being a chair versus it not being a chair. So does the composition of the chair matter? So if something is made out of ice, is it no longer a chair? I don't think so. I think you can have ice chairs. If something is made out of iron, is it no longer a chair? No, like the Iron Throne in Game of Thrones. That makes me sad because I used to use Game of Thrones in so many of my examples in classes, but ever since that last season, I don't even want to talk about it. I don't know why I even talked about it now. It just made me sad. But anyways, iron chairs, just because it's made out of iron doesn't make it a chair. It doesn't make it not a chair. So wood, iron, ice, these things would all, anything, a chair can be made out of anything. Does a chair necessarily need a certain amount of legs? I don't think so. You can have chairs with 4 legs. You can have stools that have like 2 legs, or you can have bean bags don't seem to have any legs, or like a tree trunk that doesn't seem like it has legs, but I would still consider it a chair if you're out camping. Another example, arms and backs, like armrests or a back to lean on. Again, the tree trunk has neither of these things, but I still think if you're camping, or say sit in that chair, you'd call it a chair and you wouldn't be wrong. So what is true about the structure of all and every chair that exists? Nothing. I don't think there's any structural similarity between every single chair in existence, except for the fact that they're physical objects. So to call something a chair is to describe it by its function, not its structure. And what's the function? To sit on. So if you can sit on it, it's a chair, and that's all it is to it. Some things in our vocabulary are both functional and structural. So like the periodic table of elements, it's structural, but it's put together functionally. Like the columns of the elements are all the elements that behave in a certain way, the function of the elements, but the rows are by the structure of the element. So it seems like a combination of structural and functional. So the idea here is that pain or other mental states are functional, not structural concepts. And the dualist has made this conceptual error. The dualist is trying to define pain and other mental states in terms of its structure, in terms of this non-spatial entity, the mind. But the physicalist has this option of saying, no, let's define all of our mental states, pain, happiness, color sensation, in terms of cause and effect, which means in terms of its function. So we shouldn't use experience or sensation to talk about pain. It should just be the state that's produced or caused by tissue damage, which causes behavior, fight, flight, crying, avoidance, or verbal behaviors, which, again, verbal is just another type of behavior. And they say that the only clear way to define mental terms is with this cause and effect method, not subjective experience. Because the minute you start defining pain in terms of a subjective experience, You're going to run into this problem of other minds. You're going to start to doubt whether others' experiences are the same, because we can't, again, infer from single experiences. And for all we know, that the beetle in your box isn't like the beetle in my box. So this has to do with this first person versus third person perspective and description. Just because there are two ways to describe a thing does not imply that there are two separate things. Two ways to describe this, eraser and rubber, does not imply that there's more than one thing in front of me right now. The first person is just the subjective way to describe it, this structural way to describe it. And the third person is this functional way to describe it, this cause and effect way to describe it. Because we have no direct privileged access to other minds, there's no way we can use the first person perspective to describe these mental states, these pain states. So the proponent of this argument is going to say we have to use third person perspectives only, and that the dualist is just making this conceptual mistake by treating it not in terms of cause and effect, but rather in terms of the subjective experience. And we can't have a science of psychology with purely subjective material. Like, as I mentioned last week in a video, and like I've been mentioning throughout this lecture, single instances cannot be generalizable. So this idea, this functional structural distinction, gave rise to behavioralism, which is a movement in philosophy and then a movement in psychology that emphasized the outward behavioral aspects of thought and dismissed the inward experience of the mind. So Ryle writes, yet the explanation given presupposed that one person could, in principle, never recognize the difference between the rational and irrational utterances issued from other bodies, since he could never get access to the immaterial causes of their utterances, save for the doubtful exception of the self. He could never tell the difference between a man and a robot. According to the Cartesian theory, external observers could never know how the overt behavior of others is correlated with their mental powers and processes, and so they could never know or even plausibly conjecture which of their applications of mental conduct concepts to these other people were correct or incorrect. What's his worry? That we wouldn't be able to reliably identify who out there has mental states and who out there doesn't. We couldn't tell the difference between a robot and a person, because if they're using purely subjective experience, the robot could easily give you all the right answers without giving you, without having the mental states. A purely functional definition of pain or other mental states could potentially rule out this robot versus person dilemma, but I would push back on this a little bit and say that maybe it would have the implication of just assigning mental states to robots, which we're leading down that road. Next week we're going to be talking about turning, so this is like kind of highlighting that. But it's important to note that Descartes himself had this worry too, and he thought he solved it. So I'm going to read from him right now. On the other hand, if there are machines which bore a resemblance to our body and imitated our actions as far as it was morally possible to do so, we should always have two very certain tests by which to recognize that for all that they were not real men. The first is that they could never use speech or other signs as we do when placing our thoughts on record for the benefit of others. For we can easily understand a machine's being constituted so that it can utter words and even emit some responses to action on it of a corporeal kind, which brings about a change in its organs. For instance, if it touched a particular part, it may ask what we wish for it to say, what we wish to say to it. If in another part, it may exclaim that it's being hurt, and so on. But it never happens that it arranges its speech in various ways in order to reply appropriately to everything that may be said in its presence, as even the lowest type of man can do. So Descartes thinking that no matter how sophisticated robots get, they'll never have the flexibility that us humans do, that we can respond to novel stimuli. Like I said, like you hear novel utterances of words all the time, every day, all day, and yet you understand all of them and you understand how to respond to them, most of them, all the time. The behaviorists too, I guess I'm not being very sympathetic to the behaviorists. So they would be able to tell the difference between a robot and a human because they also factor in the cause. So like the light, the fire under my arm, that matters in terms of the behavioralist picture. In terms of the functionalist picture, because a robot lighting a fire under metal, that shouldn't have any kind of that shouldn't cause anything, whereas lighting a fire under my arm should cause it, because it's a biological fact that a mortal wound should have some effects. Descartes thought, even though this is a problem of other minds, we're not going to have this problem in terms of robots. We're always going to be able to tell whether something's a robot versus a man, because men, even the stupidest of us, the lowest type of man, can always respond. They're flexible. They have a wide variety of responses to a wide variety of different stimuli. But Turing, which we're going to cover next week, directly disagrees with this. He believes that machines could pass such a test.